Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center on behalf of Lee Hamilton, our president and director, and on behalf of the Africa program, which I head. I'm Steve McDonald. We're still expecting a few more people, but I think we need to get started because I think there's going to be a lot of interest in what the minister has to say. We're very, very happy to have him here. As those of you who follow our programming know, we've been looking closely at South Africa, both the transition recently, electoral transition, and the U.S.-South Africa relations, and also specifically at the subject that Minister Davies will be addressing this morning in regional integration, both in terms of South-South cooperation and economic, and integration in terms of conflict management as well, having had a major conference on that last year. Obviously there's a lot of interest in what's happening in South Africa, and Minister Davies is probably not in an enviable position because he takes over from a man, Trevor Manuel, who we knew well and featured here a couple of times at the Woodrow Wilson Center, who was well known in the West, and there was some anxiety in economic and trade circles during the elections, or before and during the elections in May 2009 in South Africa, as to what the Zuma presidency would mean for trade, investment, economic, financial issues in general, and coupled with, of course, the recent global crisis on banking and finances, it's created even deeper anxiety. So having the minister here gives us sort of a multifaceted, multi-target to talk about several things, and he is going to be addressing us on promoting regional integration in Southern Africa, but has already expressed a willingness to address any questions you might have on South African economic trade investment policies. Now, the minister is, of course, new in his position, Minister of Trade and Industry, appointed by Jacob Zuma just after the elections in May. He was previously Deputy Minister of Trade and Industry from 2005 until the time he took over as minister. He's been a member of the Parliament since 1994, since the first democratic elections in 1994. He's an ANC member going back to 1979, where he spent exile in Mozambique. But from 1998 to 2001, he held an appointment from the U.S. Department of Treasury as advisor and alternate to the U.S. Executive Director at the African Development Bank. He has chaired the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Finance, the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Trade and Industry, as well as a subcommittee of the Constitutional Assembly responsible for Chapter 13, that's finance, has nothing to do with bankruptcy, of South African Constitution. And he holds a degree in economics from Rhodes University, a master's degree in international relations from the University of Southampton, and a doctorate in political science from the University of Sussex. So, Minister Davies, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Let me start off by saying it's a great privilege and honor to be here at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, an institution which is named for one of the great figures of multilateralism in the world. And I was saying to Steve McDonald a little earlier that those of us who have been involved in international trade negotiations, and particularly having to attend various meetings at the World Trade Organization, can't but miss another living memorial to Woodrow Wilson, the Palais Wilson that's there in Geneva. What I'm going to try to address mostly is the issue of the discussion that's going on in the United States and also in Africa about how do we actually now structure our relations between the United States and the African continent, now that we have a new administration in the United States, and as far as South Africa is concerned, also we have a new administration. And I want to try to come at this by talking, first of all, about the regional integration efforts which are underway, particularly with a focus on Southern Africa, and then see how I think the challenges of structuring extra-regional development support programs with trade and cooperation agendas, how would that fit in? and some of the lessons I think that we may want to bear in mind from some other attempts to do this. And notably, I'm going to reflect a little bit on the economic partnership agreement negotiations with the European Union. But I'm happy when we come to question and answer time. I'm happy to actually talk about anything that anybody wants to talk about to do with South and Southern Africa. So let me start off then. I want to say that we all, I think, probably set out from the general presumption that accelerating regional integration in the African continent is something which is both desirable and necessary. I think there's a number of arguments which are probably fairly familiar to most people as to why this is the case. African countries have got small economies that are orientated to production of primary products for export to the extra African continent world, and very small domestic markets unable to sustain value-added industries on their own with the domestic market, also too small to directly access the world market in new value-added lines of production. But sometimes, and particularly in our region, Southern Africa, a larger economy, which does offer the possibilities as a first step or a stepping ground for small economies to start to become more outward orientated. And these are all the, I think, familiar arguments as to why regional integration is necessary in the African continent. And it's, of course, been held to be so from the times of the establishment of the Organization of African Unity. It's basically what underpins the African Union and all the regional economic communities in the African continent. But the fundamental issue and the fundamental discussion, I think, is how is regional integration going to be promoted in a way that is sustainable and contributes to the promotion of economic growth and development. And I want to start off with a little bit of a theoretical reflection, because I think there are two important paradigms that are around in terms of regional integration. I think the one is the orthodox neoclassical customs union theory approach, which goes back in the literature to the work of Jacob Weiner, who wrote about customs unions in the 1950s. And the alternative one, which I want to actually say is the approach which we in South Africa are broadly supportive of, is an approach which is characterized in the literature as development integration. So I want to just slightly distinguish between the two. The Jacob Weiner model of regional integration, it envisages a sort of a movement up what's sometimes called the ladder of integration through a succession of formal trade arrangements, trade integration arrangements, each of them based basically on changes in tariff and other regulatory regimes. So you start off with a preferential trade area. Preferential trade area means an area where you give trade preferences to other countries, but you don't necessarily extend these throughout the tariff book. You give preferences on certain products to each other within the regional integration area. Then you move to a free trade area. And this, I think there's two meanings of this, and both of them are around in some of the discussions. First of all, there's the WTO legal definition of a free trade area. And this means that what you do is you remove duties on substantially all trade. Now, substantially all can mean 80% of trade. It doesn't have to mean literally all, but that's the alternative definition, that you remove duties on all trade, which takes place within the members of the free trade area. But, of course, what you do still have at that stage is you have each individual member of the free trade area sets the tariffs towards members towards imports from countries which are outside of the free trade area. Then you move into the customs union. A customs union, what you have is you have free trade within the area, but you also then have a common external tariff, so that there's the same tariff is charged on goods which are entering the customs union from outside by all members of the customs union. You then move to a common market, which is You have free movement of all the factors of production, so capital and labor as well. You then move to an economic union where you would have a high level of coordination of economic and regulatory policy, and you would then end up as finally perhaps as a political union or a federation or something of that sort. Now, I think that this theory broadly informed the process of integration in the European Union. Of course, the process in the United States was quite different. It was more politically driven, but in the European Union, you had a linear process, broadly speaking, that followed the Wiener model. But actually, there's a couple of things we need to note about the Wiener model. First of all, it argued that if regional integration is going to be economically beneficial, then the trade creation effects must be larger than the trade diversion effects. And what does this mean? Trade creation basically means that instead of each individual country producing the same good and one of them doing it less efficiently than the other, you now, by forming an integration arrangement, the country that's least efficient stops doing it and the country that's more efficient does it instead, and that you have trade creation as a result of this. Trade diversion would occur where actually neither of them is the most efficient producer. The most efficient producer is outside of the two of them. And what you do is you have a preference inside the region, but a high tariff wall outside, and that instead of trading with the partner outside, you trade inside, and you divert trade, which should take place outside. With an outside partner, you divert it inside. And of course, Wiener said that trade creation should exceed the benefits of trade creation should exceed those of trade diversion if the regional integration arrangement is going to yield economic benefits. And he said that such conditions generally occur when there's a high degree of complementarity. In other words, that country A produces what country B needs, country B produces what country A needs, and so on. But the problem is that those conditions generally existed or exist in developed economies, not in developing economies. In developing economies, you typically find low levels of production of goods which each other is consuming, and each of them tends to, and this is very much the case in Africa, each of them rather is producing primary products, similar primary products very often for export outside of the region. And that's the problem in terms of trying to implement this model in Africa and in developing countries. And so the literature then has created an alternative. One which questions whether a mechanical sequencing following these stages is actually what's required, and actually argues that in many cases the major barriers to intra-regional trade and promoting it and strengthening it are often not to be found in tariffs or other regulatory barriers, but are actually to be found in inadequate infrastructure and underdeveloped production structures. And I think when I come a little bit further on, I'm going to say that I believe that the experience of establishing the free trade area in SADC has shown exactly that. Because since 2005, South Africa and the other members of the Southern African Customs Union have already removed duties on more than 97% of imports from other members. But actually the pattern of trade and the imbalance of trade has changed very little. And I think that the reason for this is that it's really to be found in production capacities in other countries to produce the goods that can sell on particularly the South African market. And that becomes the central challenge. And so under circumstances of that sort, the argument that's been put forward, and I said this is broadly speaking the kind of approach which we take as the South Africa towards regional integration, is that we believe that integration arrangements must be complemented and often preceded by advances in cooperation arrangements to try to address infrastructure barriers, to try to address trade capacity building, and that all of these real economy constraints are often the real things that need to be tackled in order to promote more intra-regional trade. And to then enhance regional integration. And that this really advances in cooperation around infrastructure, intra-regional trade, capacity building, these must create the objective conditions to make a movement to a free trade area or a customs union or an economic union to make this viable and sustainable. If you try to do it without those conditions in place, what will happen is that you won't have a sustainable basis for that integration arrangement. And that this depends on a high level of political cooperation and political will at a fairly early stage of the integration process. Now, if we now come to the Southern African Development Community, and just to talk about where are we at and what are some of the challenges, debates, and issues around integration in SADC. Well, in SADC, we have since 1996, since the signature of the SADC Trade Protocol, been involved in a process of asymmetrical and differentiated removal of trade, of duties, of tariffs on substantially all trade, intra-SADC trade. There was a process under which for over 8 years, most members of SADC removed duties on goods from other members of SADC. They had 8 years to do it. And for the smaller economies, the extent to which they were required to remove duties was less than the obligations on the bigger. So we were the bigger. We are in a customs union with Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and Swaziland, so we acted together. But for the members of the customs union, we had 5 years to remove duties on, as I said already, 97% of the products coming from the other members, and that process was completed then in 2005. But in 2008, following the protocol and the start of the tariff phase downs in 2000, SADC launched its free trade area. We concluded we had now created the conditions for the free trade area. It was launched at the summit of the Southern African Development Community in August 2008. And with the launching of the free trade area, we now have a regional market where there is duty-free movement of goods on substantially all trade in a market which is now has a combined value of $360 billion and a population of 170 million. Now, 2 members of SADC have not joined the free trade area at this point in time. They happen to be the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Angola. But when those 2 countries do join, and both of them have indicated that they will, and they are in the process of doing so, that will add a further $71 billion to the total value of the regional market, and a further 77 million people to the population of that free trade area. So we now have in place in SADC a pretty substantial free trade area, 14 countries, well, with 2 still to join, but then 12 countries are currently participating in it, and with quite a sizable internal market with duty-free movement of goods. Where does the integration process go from here onwards? Well, I'm saying here to start off with that there is a debate as to where this integration process should be taking itself. SADC set up some years ago something called the Regional Indicative Strategic Development Program, and it said that according to that, the next milestone was that we should have been setting up a customs union in 2010. We should have been moving into a customs union, but I think that that was recognized that this will not be possible at the last summit, which took place in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And so the debate about where the integration process goes in SADC is now the subject of some debate and discussion. And I just want to indicate some of the ways in which we see it as South Africa. Well, for ourselves, South Africa, we think there are 2 immediate priorities. The first one is actually to consolidate the free trade area, and then to widen regional integration across the regional economic communities, starting with building a free trade area which is now bigger than the SADC one which would embrace also the East African community, which is a number of countries in East Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Burundi, Rwanda, and then a much larger grouping of countries which goes as far up as Egypt, which is the members of the Common Market of Eastern and Southern Africa. And we are all involved, and we've all agreed in SADC that there's an agenda of consolidation which we need to push further forward. There are some fairly important outstanding matters to address, like addressing questions of rules of origin. Rules of origin are not yet completed and aligned. There are some rules of origin matters on some of the more sensitive products that we still have to address. There's some very important questions of customs cooperation and general trade facilitation. I mean, we are still finding that although we may not have to pay duties when our goods cross the borders, there are still inordinately bureaucratic processes and procedures that are causing delays at borders. And so part of the work of consolidating the free trade area, and this work is ongoing right now, is to try to address those matters. And then for us as South Africa, one of the fundamental issues is to address the point I was making when we were talking about development integration. How do we address the reality that despite the fact that we have removed duties on more than 97% of our imports from other countries, there's still a big trade imbalance? And for us, this says that what we really need to do is we need to push much further forward and much more energetically with the programs of infrastructure development and some cooperation around productive sectors, and particularly industrial development. That work has been sort of there on the agenda, but has not been given enough energy up to now, in our view. But there's a set of programs called Spatial Development Initiatives, otherwise known as corridors. Some of them have operated quite successfully on a bilateral basis. For example, the corridor between ourselves and Mozambique, so-called Maputo corridor. What happens there is that we identify an infrastructure improvement, usually around a road, rail, port infrastructure improvement, and then package a series of investment activities off that, and then create conditions under which the infrastructure build actually does yield investments in other productive activities. That's one set of activities that we need to push further forward. And there's now the beginnings of a discussion about regional industrial development cooperation. Some initial work on a protocol is underway on that. And for us in South Africa, I think these are very important elements that we need to put in place to consolidate and make the free trade area that we have in SADC contribute to a more balanced pattern of trade and regional growth and development. So I've already talked about that, and then just to say that for us, now that we will not be having a customs union in 2010, the question arises when and how does the customs union come in place in SADC, and we are saying that for us, we need to recognise is going to be a major endeavour. That will require us to reach a common understanding of what is the objective of tariff policy generally. For us, we believe that tariff policy ought to be a tool of industrial development, and then that we need to embark on a process of properly negotiating a common external tariff, which we don't believe will be anything that will be achieved in a very accelerated time frame, and that we need to accept that this is something which will take time and need to be built on a solid foundation of a functioning free trade area together with functioning cooperation programs. Then the other point which I made, the other important priority which we've actually all agreed in SADC is a priority, is to enlarge this free trade area by consolidating with the COMESA and the East African community. And I think that this would be a very, very major step if we achieved it. It would actually put in place a free trade area from Cape to Cairo, quite literally. And the next step one could envisage would be that that big FTA would start to talk to West Africa, which would be outside of this arrangement at this stage. But this has been identified and agreed by the SADC trade ministers as the next big priority for us in regional integration, so that we would be moving ahead with bigger free trade areas across the continent. Now, as I say, this, in a nutshell, broadly speaking, is the regional integration agenda. I now want to just say, because I think that this is the debate and the discussion, how do third country programs that are seeking to create arrangements of trade, arrangements that are supposed to support development and integration. How should these be structured? And I think this is some of the debate that's going on in the United States around AGOA at this point in time. And I thought that it might be just useful to have a little bit of a reflection on one of the other programs, which is the Economic Partnership Agreement process, which has been going on between the European Union and different African, Caribbean, and Pacific regions, several of them on the African continent. Well, the EPA was driven by a desire to move from non-reciprocal preferences. Under the previous Cotonou Agreement, there were non-reciprocal preferences granted to African, Caribbean, Pacific countries to enter the European market. They didn't have to reciprocate in terms of offering anything to the European Union. But the EPA was driven by a desire to move from that to establish reciprocal free trade agreements. There was also a perceived need which underlaid the EPA process of distinguishing between least developed countries, so-called advanced developing countries, which we happen to be one, and other developing countries. Make some distinctions between those kinds of categories. I think it was also shaped by broader ambitions to promote trade-related commitments in areas such as investment rules, competition law, etc., etc. A series of ambitions which I think had very little to do with the relations with ACP countries as such, but more to do with broader trade-related policy ambitions by the European Union. And also there was a desire to encompass not just trade in goods but also trade in services. Now, in the course of negotiating with the European Union, actually what has happened, and I think this is a very fundamental reality, is that SADC countries have found themselves divided into 4 separate negotiating configurations. Some of them are in the Eastern Southern African group. One of them is in the Central African group, one of them is in the East African community, and then the rest of us are called part of the SADC EPA group, but that's only a small part of the SADC, total SADC membership. Now, the result of this is that all of us, just on the straight trade in goods, all of us have got different obligations towards the EU, different tariff phase downs and so on. So there's already some differentiation taking place just on the trading goods arrangements with the European Union. But more than that, some of us have said that negotiating trading services with the European Union is a good idea and have started to do it. Others of us have said we see very little benefit from negotiating trading services bilaterally. We'd rather negotiate it multilaterally. Others of us, and all of this is happening where we don't yet have, we're not at the stage of integration where we have a trading services agreement among ourselves. So some of us are negotiating with Europe, others are not, and we don't have any arrangements among ourselves. Trade-related commitments, well, some of them, some members, some countries have accepted some of these. The reason why was that many of them were told if you sign on and accept these, then your market access will be secure. If you don't, on the other hand, your market access will not be secure. And for some of our neighbours, this was a particularly important issue. Those that exported beef into the European Union, under Cotonou they got a quota, but it was duty-free. They were told if they signed on, the quota would go. They could sell whatever they could produce duty-free. But if they didn't, then they would have a general system of preferences. They'd pay 90% duty. And under that, some have signed, others have not. Different obligations. That includes some members of the Southern African Customs Union. Some have signed, others have not. Different obligations. And so this is what I'm saying here. Even within the SACU, Southern African Customs Union, we're actually the oldest customs union in the world. We'll be having our centenary next year. But now we've got differentiated commitments, which is threatening to undermine our cohesion. And although this is the conclusion I want to reach, the stated aim of the EPAs was to strengthen regional integration. In our view, this process up to now has been that they've become a complicating rather than an enhancing factor in regional integration. So how does this come into the discussions here for AGOA? Well, our view as South Africa, I think this is the view of the African ministers at the AGOA forum in Nairobi, is that the basic AGOA architecture does not need replacing. We believe that the basic AGOA, African Growth and Opportunity Act architecture, should be retained. We do, however, think that it could be improved. And it could be improved in the following ways. First of all, if there was greater certainty about the long-term prospects of this, and in particular, there's the question of the third country apparel issue, which would expire in 2012, and then the overall AGOA is due to expire in 2015. If that could be prolonged and that could give certainty, we believe it would encourage investments in productive activities in the African continent, particularly those producing goods for export into the United States. We also believe that inclusion of all countries in regional groupings in the same arrangement would enhance regional integration. Where there is some idea that some countries are big and important and don't need this, that, or the other concession, but they're in the same regional integration arrangement, and actually it's important that they're there because they provide the access and the market and the partnership capacity that the other countries need. But if you start creating a differentiated set of obligations based on the idea that one is bigger than the other, then we think that can have the effects, as we've seen with the EPA, of dividing regional integration arrangements. We think that widening the product coverage will also assist in product diversification. And we would agree, though, with this report from there's a report which has come from the U.S. Government Accountability Office to Congress, which has said that the enhancing AGOA needs to be coupled with infrastructure development assistance, trade capacity building, and that these are very critical complementary measures. And within the whole approach which we've been talking about of regional integration and a developmental approach, I mean, we would agree absolutely that is pretty fundamental. And therefore, that is the point which you're saying, that building trade capacity is quite fundamental in supporting regional integration arrangements. So I think that's the central points that we wanted to make by way of introduction. We're saying that regional integration is very fundamental, and we're saying that any kind of extra regional arrangements which we negotiate with third parties or third parties negotiate with us, which are intended to support growth and development, needs to be sensitive, needs to be supportive of regional integration arrangements, not just in the declaratory statements that accompany them, but actually in the details of the arrangements that are actually put in place. So let me stop there, and as I said earlier, I'm happy to entertain discussion about anything. Doesn't have to be on any of the stuff I've been talking about just now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Davies. That was very, very thorough, and even a layman like myself understood it, so that you've gone a long way to bring this on board. We will take questions and answers now for approximately the next 40 minutes. You know the drill here, most of you. We will have microphones to be handed to the questioner. I will recognize you, then please identify yourselves. And the Minister, as he has repeated, will take questions on anything to do with South Africa, economic integration or otherwise. Okay? Here's one. Whitney?
Thank you. Whitney Schneidman, Schneidman Associates International. Minister Davies, thank you for a very insightful presentation. Certainly the whole emphasis on regional integration, I think, has been critical to the U.S. For a long time. Certainly it's important in the African context. I basically have two questions. One, the first one's with AGOA. I think you're absolutely right that the architecture remains as critical to U.S. African economic issues, and you're also correct that it needs to be lengthened, the time frame, and there are many who are calling for another 10 years. There's also an emphasis to switch the focus to investment. that there'd be a tax incentive to encourage more American investment in productive sectors such as agriculture, infrastructure, outside the extractive sectors. But my question in this respect revolves around Ambassador Kirk and the message that he brought to the AGOA Forum when it comes to agricultural products. And he basically said that these should not be dealt with in the context of the U.S. unilaterally reducing barriers to agricultural products such as cotton, groundnuts, etc., but that this should be dealt with in the context of the Doha round. And I'm very interested in your view about Doha and that issue in particular. My second question is sort of a look back, a look forward. A major effort was made in the last administration to create a free trade agreement between the U.S. and SACU, and it did not succeed. And I'm curious as to your opinion about whether that should be looked at again, whether this could in fact help to accelerate the development process. It's interesting that South Africa has a free trade agreement with the EU, but the U.S. couldn't get one with SACU. So let me just stop there and interested in your views. Thanks.
Okay. Minister, why don't we go ahead and take those questions. We'll take two or three at a time, but as Whitney started with two, I think that gives you plenty of meat to chew on.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that we would support the idea that encouragement of investment is a critical component of the broader AGOA. I mean, we'd have to look and see what the details mean in terms of a proposal about tax incentives and so on. But I mean, I think that the idea that mobilization of investment in generating productive activity is a critical component that needs building on, I think we would agree with that. On the agricultural products, well, look, I think there's two dimensions there. There's first of all there's the straight market access, which is the tariff free or tariff reduced, and a number of agricultural products are covered under AGOA. I think that we could improve on that within the AGOA framework. For example, I'll give you an example from South Africa that canned pears are covered under AGOA. We get duty-free, but we don't produce that many canned pears. We produce canned peaches, and here there's a sensitivity, and they are excluded. So, if we could make those improvements, I think that would help. I think the point you're talking about with cotton and so on, that comes into the question of subsidies, I think that we have accepted and come to accept that we're not going to address the question of subsidies, which I do think is the major barrier to African countries realizing their potential competitive advantages from agriculture and agro-industrial production. We've come to the conclusion reluctantly that on a bilateral basis or a plurilateral basis, we're not going to address that. That would have to be addressed within the context of the multilateral process. Now, that you asked me what I think of the prospects for Doha. Well, there are many political commitments that say we must conclude this thing by next year, as you know, and they were repeated once again even at Pittsburgh. But I think that there is a fairly substantial gap between the political commitment that's being made at the top and the reality of the negotiating process on the ground. And I think there's some fairly big and important paradigms which are competing. One, which is the paradigm that I think a number of those that are calling for an early conclusion are supporting, is the idea that the work has already been done to a very large extent, and we have the chair's text on agriculture and the non-agricultural market access as they were produced up to the end of last year and refined a little bit since then, and that basically that architecture must be the basis of an agreement. And then we have the view, which is also the view of the United States, that actually that's not good enough. And that what's emerged from that is not something which is saleable in Congress and so on. Now, a number of key players have said if that is going to be the approach, it's not going to happen by the end of 2010. We're in a slightly different position as South Africa. We are not actually one of those who's been a huge demander for an early conclusion. Our call has been for a fair developmental outcome that's loyal and to the mandate. And we actually don't believe that the balances have been correct in the work that's emerged up to now. And in particular for South Africa, we've got a very particular problem, and that is that during the Uruguay round, South Africa, part of the arrogance of the old regime, they called us a developed country. And we took all the cuts and obligations under the Uruguay round, slightly modified right towards the end of the process with an intervention by, not yet, but becoming President Nelson Mandela, slightly modified for clothing and textiles in the motor industry, but otherwise we took the cuts and obligations of the developed countries. And what this means is it means when the formulas applied to us, we are in a very invidious position of actually taking much more cuts than anybody else on any subject in the round, and that's been acknowledged by the parties in the negotiation. So we're in a very difficult position. We are not in a position to be able to offer anybody, the United States or anybody else, more market access in industrial products. In fact, we need more flexibilities, and that's been acknowledged. So whereas China, Brazil, and India have all said, in the discussions we had in India, they said they're at the wire in terms of what they've offered. I've said we've been pulled over the wire. We need to come back. So we find ourselves in a somewhat unique and different position to everybody else. But whether the Doha round will conclude anytime soon or not is anybody's guess. And I think that, as I say, there are still many many hurdles in terms of the practical matters on the ground. Now, in terms of the last point, the FTA with SACU FTA, I think some of the problems with that, which in fact everybody in SACU agreed were problems, were that there was very little give and take. What happened was that there was an approach which was more or less calling for almost a literal removal of duties, no asymmetry, no differentiation, unlike what I said we did even within SADC. It was also overladen with some very straightforward, take it or leave it, trade-related demands around intellectual property and stuff like that, in a context where we actually don't have, again, a point I should have made, obligations we may take on competition, investment law, or something like that. We don't have any common laws or arrangements even within SACU, never mind within the rest of SADC. So I think those became the difficulties, and if that was to be the basis of a revival, I think we'd probably end up with the same result. But what we are doing, I think a GOA has been useful to all of us. I would say stick with the GOA. And then we have another thing which we are negotiating now, and the negotiations are going to carry on at technical level next month, actually. It's called TIDCA, a Trade Investment Development Cooperation Agreement. And TIDCA is important trade facilitation matters. I mean, sanitary, phytosanitary, customs cooperation, standards, all of those kinds of things, which I think if you look at the list of disputes, which we all have disputes, trade disputes, those are the matters that are matters of disputes. Sanitary, phytosanitary standards, customs regulations, that sort of stuff. And I think that negotiation could be, I mean, look, we all committed ourselves to doing it at the GOA Forum, and the technical people are supposed to start negotiating on the 9th of next month. So I'm fairly hopeful of that, and I think that will be an important step forward.
You can field the questions from down here if you prefer.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, fine.
Okay, next hand I saw was right behind Whitney there. Yes, please.
My name is John Panzer. I work at the World Bank. Mr. Minister, it's a pleasure to be able to interact with you. I have a question in terms of the broader mandate of your ministry. Perhaps the biggest challenge that South Africa faces is the issue of employment and creation of jobs. And as you mentioned, one of the legacies of the past regime of apartheid is the fact that you have an industry or an economy which tends to be capital intensive. It tends to be human capital intensive in the sectors in which it's most competitive, and it's energy intensive as well. And that industry exists, is successful in many ways, and it creates its whole constituencies and interest groups. And it's not clear how you can transition to that, to an economy that can really be more labor intensive and accommodate the needs of all that population, some of which is unskilled. So in that context, what is your view of how you make that transition, and particularly with trade policy and industrial policy, which might be a little bit against some of the issues you have just mentioned?
Okay, thank you. Let's take one from the center here. The next hand I saw right here. Yes. Mm-hmm. And don't forget to identify yourself.
I'm Mohammed Qasim. I'm an investor. Actually, I'm a financial advisor, because a financial advisor is one who doesn't need money. Investor has the money. But anyway, I was born in East Africa. I had a business in Zambia. I had about 16,000 hectares of ranching. And because of the economic policies of Mr. Kaunda, Julius Nyerere, and the nefarious World Bank, I'm now a member of the working class. Economic disintegration. Trade agreements are extraordinarily complicated things to do. I mean, you've got thousands of vested interest groups fighting each other. I'm doing some projects in South Africa right now, and I see enormous changes taking place. Here, of course, we focus on the relationship with the United States, but what are your, speaking as a minister, what is the comparative advantage for South Africa? How, and in this dynamic world, how do we then relate with China? And specifically what I call the chopstick belt, which is Beijing down to Singapore, and 300 miles on either side, because that's the new economic center.
Okay, thank you. We'll take one more for the minister. I saw the hand here first. Yeah.
Thank you, Minister Davies. I'm Pinky Chowdhury, World Bank's Africa Regional Integration Unit. I had a question a little bit broader about Africa's regional integration aspirations as a continent. What is your relationship with African Union and their minimum integration program? The second question is, as we know, Africa is much more regionally integrated than, say, South Asia, and has an institutional architecture of RECs. That said, it has been pointed out that the capacity of the regional economic communities to deliver on their various mandates has not been up to par. What is your government's intention to intervene in that regard, or take a leadership role in that regard? We know that ACBF recently did a study on capacity of regional economic communities, but there wasn't any consensus reached about the recommendations of that study. So given that the regional economic community infrastructure exists, how do you see an opportunity to make use of it, optimize it? And the first question was about the MIP of African Union. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Minister?
Okay, well, thanks. I think the first question went absolutely to the heart of the economic challenge facing us in South Africa. I mean, what we face in South Africa is a massive challenge of structural unemployment. And I want to emphasize structural unemployment. I think it was demonstrated by the fact that what happened before the recession. We had the longest period of uninterrupted growth, I think more or less since statistics were recorded. In South Africa, our growth rate hit a maximum of just over 5%. But our structural unemployment, or our unemployment on the strict definition, never went below 21%. That was the best it hit. And then if we take people who had given up looking for work, it was in the 30s. So I think that what that says to us is that what we need to affect in our economy is structural change. I think the reason for the unemployment, the structural unemployment, is that there was a very important shift that took place in the South African economy actually from the mid-1970s onwards. Prior to that, it had absorbed large numbers of unskilled people in pick and shovel work in the mining industry as migrant workers. That's what it did. And then from the mid-70s onwards, the gold production hit its peak, and the gold that was there started to be only extractable with higher capital-intensive methods and so on. And we've seen a vast expulsion of people from that form of economic activity, initially into the so-called homelands, and then when influx control went, they've been moving into the towns. So we have a large number of unskilled, unemployed people in our country. That's what it is. And I think you're also quite correct to say that a lot of the pre-existing industry which was there, industry which, by the way, emerged with a lot of support from the previous governments, like Sasol, ISCOR, which is now Mittal Steel, and so on. They were all upstream, capital-intensive industrial activities. Now, and energy intensive, I think, as you were saying as well. Now, the thrust of our industrial policy is actually to try to make some of the changes which we think are going to be important to absorb more labor. So in each of the sectors which we choose as our priority sectors, and I could name them, but there's so much point, we're trying to deliberately target the more downstream, more labor-absorbing part of a particular value chain, and to give the emphasis to that. And so, for example, we have in our tariff policy, we've taken, I think, some quite interesting strategic decisions. We have removed tariffs. Upstream suppliers of, for example, steel products, where the price of steel is an important barrier to a whole range of downstream engineering industry, we've taken the tariff away. But we will use a tariff to support downstream industries, at least on an infant industry basis, until they are up and running. Now, one of the things that I think where we have an opportunity in South Africa, a huge opportunity, is our biggest counter-cyclical program, which I think has stood us in some good stead in the recession, even though we are battered by the recession, and I make no bones about that, is that we have already in place a very substantial infrastructure investment program. Only some part of it is directly related to hosting the 2010 Soccer World Cup. There's parts of it to do with energy, roads, rails, telecommunications, all sorts of things. And that program is even the one which we have now, the currently costed program, which is 787 billion rand, or I suppose 100 billion US dollars, is part of much longer programs which are likely to go on for 20, 25 years or so. And what we need to do, and this is our challenge, is to make sure that that we are producing much more of the industrial inputs into those programs than we currently are. And that's going to be the big focus of the next phase of our industrial policy action plan. We also think that the kinds of infrastructure investments that we are making in South Africa will be the kinds of infrastructure investments that other countries in Africa will be needing, and that we will need to be cooperating with them in order to achieve even some of the goals of regional integration I was talking about. And that if we develop industrial capacity to service that, which can also link up with the creation of value chains that other countries can be part of, that will also spur regional infrastructure related industrial development. That we think is one of the big areas. I mean, there are others as well. Agro industries. I think we've made enough headway on agro industries. We had situation a few years ago when the food prices were up, where we were, for the first time ever, a net food importing country. If you broke that down a bit, the stuff coming out of the ground, the actual agricultural products, we were still not. But it was processed agricultural products. And I think that's going to be another major focus. But there are going to be others as well. But in each of those, we're targeting the more downstream the more labor-absorbing activities. I mean, we're in a defensive struggle at the moment as well. I mean, the thing is that our industrial sector is being battered. We've lost 500,000 jobs since the recession started, and some of the parts of our industrial sector which have been most hard hit, no big surprises, the motor sector, and we're having to be defensive on existing industrial capacity for the reason, as is this, that if a mine suffers in a recession, as our mining sector is, generally what happens is you just don't produce, but the asset stays under the ground, and later on you come back and do it. Whereas in industry, if you stop industrial activity, you lose the industrial capacity. You may not ever get it back again. So we're having to act defensively as well, but we're trying to act defensively in ways which can create linkages to trying to move us onto a different growth path. So I think these are the kind of challenges that are around. But I mean, you're no doubt correct about the capital intensity and the energy intensity. I mean, I think across our industries now, we're going to have to. I mean, I was just walking past here to come here. We see all these, green diesel trucks and things out here. Every industry, I think, in the world is going to have to become much more energy sensitive and much more green in its overall approach. And I think we're going to have to be there as well. And in addition to that, there are some particular industries that I think we have some advantages in, which are things like solar water heaters, solar energy, electrical energy generation, and stuff like that. So these are that's just a flavour of a few of the other things that we were talking about. And I think that gets onto the question that Mohammed Qasim raised about our competitive advantage. I think that's going to be in those sorts of areas where I think we can build a competitive advantage and take us away from the existing comparative advantage, natural comparative advantage which we've had as producer of primary products, primary mineral products, because like all producers of low value-added mineral products, we have suffered very badly. Those activities have suffered very badly in this recession. Then you said trade agreements are complex and difficult. Yes, they are. They are, and I think that very often when you come to it, I mean it's bargaining over vested interests. I think that's the way I see it. When somebody tells you it's not like that, I'm very cynical. So you can expend an enormous amount of energy on negotiating trade arrangements, and in the end of the day, it has very little impact on your own real economic activity. But having said that, I think you raised an important question about China, because for all of us, the strongly emerging countries of China, India, Brazil, those countries, those economies are actually important new players. Actually, I just looked on my website this morning, and the news is that China became South Africa's first export destination for the first time ever. Replaced the United States, actually. So there we are. China is our number one export destination. It's been our number one source of imports for a long time. But now it's our export destination. What we do, though, in our trade with China is it's very much replicates the patterns of trade we have with other big economies. We import value-added products from them, and most of our mix to them is not value-added products. It's materials. I think there are possibilities for us to negotiate cooperative arrangements with China in which we begin to change that mix, and that's something which we're going to be exploring. We definitely are. And also with India and also with Brazil, we have a number of cooperative arrangements with them, and I think that there's no doubt that that'll be a very important part of our trade negotiating efforts. Then on the AU, well, the AU's minimum integration program is actually fed into the SADC RISDP. That's where it comes in. But I think what I'm suggesting is we need to take up a little bit this debate about this move to customs unions, because one of the things about regional integration arrangements, if one looks at Latin America in the 1960s, there were millions and millions of institutions, and all sorts of agreements and arrangements were made. But if they were not underpinned by things on the ground, those things went. And I think that's one of the challenges. Customs unions, we can call ourselves a customs union, but do we have a real customs union? And I think that's something which is a really important question. I mean, if we are going to have a customs union, one of the studies which the SADC Secretariat commissioned, they said it took 11 years for the EU to negotiate its common external tariff. 11 years. And I don't think there's a quick fix for us in Southern Africa, actually. We have a tariff book which has been simplified, has been reduced, the tariff, overall incidence of tariffs has been reduced, but which is still a tariff setting process in which we make decisions on the basis of individual industries, on the basis of an evaluation by an independent body, International Trade Administration Commission. That's how we make tariff decisions, and I think we need something like that wherever we operate, whatever level of integration we operate under. For many other countries, I think they've all got a small number of sectors where they want tariff policy to play that role. But for many others, tariffs is an instrument of revenue raising. Fundamentally, that. Now we're going to have to sort that one out. What is the objective of a tariff policy? How are tariffs going to be set, and all of that? And I think that's not going to be easy work. And I think we just have to accept that's not going to be easy work, and that it's going to become much more easy for us to address those complicated questions when we start to have some understandings about the direction of regional industrialization, when we start to understand where are the things that we want to focus on, and we all agree on that. And that means that some of the other elements that I was talking about, the real economy, cooperation things, I think these things have to be in place and functioning to a much greater extent. So I suppose the debate is in practice, whereas the sort of approach was that we were going to go through to deepen integration within the RECs before we went to widening integration. Actually, in practice, with the East African community and with COMESA, we're actually widening integration. Maybe that's the first step, widen integration at an FTA level, and then move from there. But I do think that the existing institutions, the existing RECs, do create an institutional base that we need to work with. Yes, I think they need to be strengthened. And we in South Africa, we're committed to working with our partners in SADC to strengthen the institutions. And, these bodies are quite fundamental to us.
Okay, thank you. I had two questions down here in the front. Okay.
Robert Kirk, AECOM International Development. I'd like to ask the Minister about the current difficulties within SACU, which Minister alluded to with the fractionalism coming from the negotiation over the EPAs. But the specific question related to that is the crisis over the revenue sharing arrangement, and whether you have any, whether there's a push to renegotiate that and move to a new agreement, because as you rightly point out, revenue from tariffs, or in the case of SACU, revenue from tariffs plus excise duty, is an extremely important source of income for these countries. And as you know, in the case of Swaziland and Lesotho, it's absolutely vital. So, I mean, the recent meeting in Swaziland, I wondered if you shed any light on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Did I see one? Yeah, here was a question I saw, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. I'm Ken Yates from Jefferson Waterman International. South Africa was involved in an integration effort for many years on railroads in Africa, and it had a vision of integrating particularly the southern part of the continent, the rail system that would be standardized and allow internal communication. What's the status of that particular program now? Where's it going? And is it really feasible to be done? I mean, it was based, all of the railroads in Africa, for the most part, were based on the extractive industries that have very volatile conditions based on world economy. So the integration of the entire area would need the kind of internal connections you would assume that are apart from these extractive industries, which don't necessarily relate to the internal exchange.
Okay. And had another question right down front here. That'll be our last one in this round. Steve?
Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. Some people think the Doha round is dead. I think it will be revived as soon as medicals passes in the U.S. But there's one issue which I'm somewhat surprised, perhaps, that it hasn't received more attention. That is the fact that the WTO itself consists of many impediments to the creation of regional economic communities, and impediments that no one really cares about except they happen to be in writing or something, particularly the insistence on treating the 13 non-LDC countries in Sub-Saharan Africa differently than the LDCs, and so on. And I was wondering whether there was any thought given to try to modify this, because it's kind of a joke, in fact it is in the United States, to say Gabon is some political power that's threatening to undermine U.S. industry, or I can't sleep because of Cameroon tires, or whatever the particular issue is. There were some very good points that were discussed at the AGOA Forum, and just for your information, a few of us are putting together a proposal to try to follow up those discussions, which we call PAGO, the Partnership with Africa, for Economic Growth and Opportunities, and one aspect of that will be something in the WTO. Thank you.
Okay. Well, start off with the Southern African Customs Union. Well, I did indicate in my input even now that I think that the way the EPA process unfolded and the sort of pressures that were put on different countries led to different obligations even within SACU, and I think that's been the issue that we've raised most strongly. We have tried to moderate the impact, the disintegrating impact of those on SACU with, I don't know, some more limited success since the new commissioner took over, but still quite a lot of unfinished business that's taking place. I think our broad approach to SACU is that although this is, as I said, the oldest customs union in the world, it's celebrating its centenary, for most of that time it was a relationship of convenience driven around revenue. South Africa got privileged access into the markets of the other members, and in return for that they got a disproportionate share of the common revenue pool. That's how it was. It was not an instrument of developmental integration. It was never that. And our view is that it can begin to move itself in that direction. It has the potential to become something which is starting to move beyond a customs union. Actually can start to take some steps towards becoming something of an economic union. And that would center around a number of cross-border regional infrastructure and industrial projects. That will come immediately up against the revenue issue, because at the moment we don't have any part of the revenue pool that is available for any cross-border project. We're nothing. It's all distributed, and national states all use it in their own way. But we have put that forward as a possibility. I think our view is that either SACU begins to move in that direction, or all these other forces are going to knock it back closer to a free trade area than to a real functioning customs union. And that's the challenge that faces all of us in SACU. And those are the sort of points that we keep making. I'm a little bit constrained because we all agreed at the meeting in Swaziland that we would only speak through the chairperson. But the chairperson indicated that we all committed ourselves, at least, to beginning to work along these lines and enhance our cooperation. On the question of the railway roads and things like that, well, I think there were different phases in which railroads became instruments of integration. I think that during the 80s there was quite a serious attempt by the then apartheid regime to try to undermine alternative routes using rail diplomacy and differentiated rates and so on, to try to bring the cargo from Zambia, let's say, instead of going to Tanzania, to come through South Africa, that sort of thing. And unfortunately, I think that all of that got overlaid with those politics of that time. But the idea that communications networks can become tools of regional integration, I think has found its expression most in our context, in what I mentioned earlier on, something called the spatial development initiatives. And there are a few of these on the ground. There's one of them is a north-south one, which is going from Zambia down south, and there's a number of them that are on the cards in one way and another. But the essential thing about them is that you address an infrastructure need, a road, rail, telecommunications corridor. You package all that together, and around that you build a broader investment in a range of industries that operate along that. And you create some authority or other that operates this thing. And so you've got, the Maputo corridor is I think the most successful one at the moment, which has continued, even though all the infrastructure investments are there. There's still a whole range of activities around that, and it has spawned some real investment opportunities on both sides of the border. But I think probably most importantly for Maputo, for Mozambique. So I think that is the way in which I think infrastructure can become used as a tool of integration. Yes, one of the problems has been that most of the corridors were around resource outlets to the sea, so you can't actually go. Say Mozambique, you can't actually go very easily up the country. You can go across it in various ways. But I think that the potentiality for developing corridors around other forms of activity is also there as well, and that needs to be followed up and developed. I mean, our view is that we haven't taken this thing far enough. That's what I'm saying. We need to have more of that, advancing much more before we can start really talking seriously about a customs union. I think those are the sort of propositions that I'm putting forward. Well, is the DDA as dead as a doha? I don't know. I mean, I think there are some. Well, as you probably know, the attempt now and every statement that you hear from, for example, the G20, is all predicated on the notion that you've got to finish the whole damn thing before the midterm elections, and also those happen to be also the Brazilian elections. That's the sort of presumption behind all of that. But I think you're raising a point which I think. Probably my cynicism would tend to go along with you actually. They're not likely to happen before the midterm elections. I mean, now ministers were supposed to take stock in November, and I see now in Pittsburgh ministers are now supposed to take stock early next year. And I can't see how we're actually going to agree modalities, advance on all the other subjects, and then have the scheduling all before midterm elections. I would think is very unlikely. So I think we are actually more likely talking about something afterwards. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it will happen then either, because I think the issues that have bedeviled it along the way have not been lack of hard work, lack of political will to conclude. They've actually been the substantive issues in the negotiation. That's what they've been all the time. And I think that they are, our view, which we've expressed, is we think that there is a pretty moderate level of ambition that has emerged in agricultural reform on subsidies. Basically, the production subsidies as well as on the export subsidies. A fairly modest level of ambition. Lots of flexibilities have been accommodated in that, and then that's going along with quite high levels of demands on industrial tariffs. And I think that there's a fundamental issue there, which I think has bedeviled the whole discussion. At every juncture, every attempt to try to finalize it has bedeviled it up to now. And I'm not sure that unless the fundamental issues are addressed in a different kind of a way, that we're going to have a different result in a different political context. There's always some or other thing which is the last moment to solve this thing. I can remember when the the Bush administration's TPA was going to expire. This was the last moment to do it, and then it did expire, and then there was something else that became the last moment, and something else. So I don't know. I think think we've been there again, been there, done that, and I don't know. As I said to you before, our interest as South Africa, we never set any of these deadlines. I mean, we want a developmental outcome which is loyal to the mandate of Doha. Whenever that happens, we'll take it. If we have to wait for it, we'll wait for it. So we're not one of the demanders to finish this thing before or after the midterm elections. That's somebody else's issue. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions. I see a quick hand back here.
Thank you very much. Paul Brenton, also from the World Bank. In the context of regional integration, you talk mainly about trading goods, and I just want to raise the issue of services, because services are a key part of the development agenda, and they're a key issue for raising the productive capacities that you were talking about: access to finance, access to telecommunications, good transport services. So in addition to the infrastructure, it's the services that are using that infrastructure that are also important. And I just wonder what your view is, your approach is in SADC on trade and services, and also in the context of the WTO and the EPAs, what opportunities these are creating for improving access and getting more competitive services in Southern Africa. Thank you.
Okay, do I have one more hand? Or yeah, I thought I'd seen one.
Hi, I'm Mary Berger with Washington Trade Daily. Minister Davies, earlier you mentioned the problems that caused the U.S. SACU FTA negotiations to fall apart. And it seems to me all those issues are still there. So do you think that there's any hope for reviving SACU? And if not, do you think a U.S.-South Africa bilateral FTA would be possible? Thanks.
Okay, we're going to let those two questions be our last. Minister?
Okay, thank you. Well, I think there's no doubt that services are increasingly important economic activities in both developed and developing countries. But I think the issue is, as I said before, that yes, we are talking about moving towards some sort of trading services agreement among ourselves, but we're not there yet. And until we're there yet, a situation in which some countries are taking on board trading services obligations towards the EU and others are not, is going to create some disjunctures that may in fact make it more complicated when we reach a stage of a trading services agreement among ourselves. As far as we are concerned, I think that if we look at the EPAs, and I think the same would apply if we were talking to the US, we would be talking about a bilateral agreement on trading services between a strong services exporting country and weak services exporting countries. I mean, we have a few services companies that are involved in the United States and involved in the European Union, but the vast bulk is the other way around. Many more US or EU service companies that are involved in South Africa and in Southern Africa. We would be interested and are much more interested in a multilateral services agreement. And in the Doha process, I think many people have been quite surprised at our offer. We have a pretty open services regime, and we're offering to enhance it in various ways. Our offer, I think, has gone down pretty well, and our opportunities in terms of trading services for South African companies is probably much more in the Middle East and places like that than it is in the United States and the European Union and so on. So frankly, a bilateral doesn't interest us. I think many of the other countries, to be perfectly honest, are not really interested in a trading services agreement either, but that they hope that if they sign a trading services agreement that there may be a packet of aid to assist services development. I'm not sure that that's forthcoming either. So the purposes and benefits of a trading services agreement on a bilateral basis with a major trading bloc and tiny little countries, I don't know. And then if you want to take where are potentially maybe, if there's a little bit of opportunity for us to make use of trading services agreements, well, Mode 4. temporary movement of persons. On the bilateral level, absolutely not a thing is given. And the EU and the Caribbean, and they negotiated this, and the CARIFORUM people said entertainment and sports people, I think they've got mode 4, and they said no quota. Oh, got something. But actually they have to be graduates. So your cricket players have got to be graduates. So, I think this is mode 4, where is probably where developing countries could make some headway, but that comes up against immigration policies, and I think that's really where it's at. So it largely is a process where we would give and we would get comparatively little, whereas a multilateral one we can give and receive on a more equitable basis. So I think that's how we would see that. I think probably what I'm suggesting, rather than reviving an FTA at all, is that we need to continue with the AGOA. That either on a bilateral basis or we can't actually, unless we resign from SACU, we can't actually negotiate on our own a trade agreement. That's what we're bound to with the SACU agreement. That when we do enter into a trade negotiation, it is with SACU. And in fact, I don't think there was any issues. I mean, the issues with the EU led to divisions in different decisions that were taken among SACU players. But everyone in SACU was united that we couldn't do the FTA as proposed with the US for the reasons I mentioned earlier on. It wasn't I think you have to present us with a very different proposal, and we don't think that would be an advantage really over the existing AGOA thing. I think we're calling for the continuation of AGOA. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister Rob Davies. I think this has been a most instructive and interesting morning. Let's give him a good hand of applause.